Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to using data to improve learner outcomes. I'm Maureen from UFI. I'm just in the background helping with any technical issues you may be having. So if you are having problems, feel free to mention something in the chat and I'll do my best to help you. We'll get started in a couple of minutes at 1 o'clock. Yeah, so we have Paul Milner and Paul Foss from National Numeracy joining us this morning. Really excited to have you. And yeah, so I have a minute or so before we get started. Paul, I'll hand over to you. You know which one you are.
Great, thanks, Maureen. I think we're just coming up to 1 o'clock, so let's get going. Thanks everyone for joining today. Paul and I from National Numeracy. National Numeracy is an independent charity, and our aim is to improve numeracy across the UK. And by numeracy, we mean having the confidence to use the right bits of maths in daily life as situations arise, but particularly in the workplace. Now, in a moment, Paul's going to take you through some examples of how we're using data at the moment to improve outcomes for users. If you've got questions that occur, just pop them on the right. There should be a questions box. You can put them in, and then we'll take the questions at the end. I'm just going to explain a couple of things before Paul takes you through these examples, which should help with understanding what we're talking about. So we've really appreciated some brilliant support from UFI over recent years, not least in developing our National Numeracy Challenge website, which is on the next slide. So the National Numeracy Challenge is a website that any adult can use to improve their everyday math skills or improve their confidence with numbers. And I was trying to think back to how or why data became so central to the work we do and actually our sort of day jobs in the charity. And I think it's because when we first launched this website, the challenge, it wasn't so much about a place where you could improve your skills, it was really a place where you could check your skills thoroughly. So we had to create an adaptive assessment that would give a really robust and accurate reading of somebody's skills level and their strengths and weaknesses. So to do that right at the start, we were sort of knee deep in data. We had to collect all the different data points in order to feed this back to the user effectively. So we did that, but then as we progressed, we started to realize that collecting all this data actually enabled us to demonstrate impact, i.e. for us, improvement in skills or improvement in confidence. And as time went on as a charity, that became more and more important because we can't seek funding without demonstration of impact. But the other thing we started to notice was that this data helps us to understand how people are behaving to get to the website, if you marry it with Google Analytics, within the website, and then after they leave the website. So you've got quite a powerful amount of data, which we started to use to inform the development that we wanted to do to improve the website, to improve the outcomes for learners. Now, this is no substitute for actually talking to the target audience at all, but if you do both, if you talk to your target audience and you've got this data that illustrates how they're behaving, then you've got a real opportunity to prioritize the development that's going to bring the best results, but also to get that right the first time, which makes it very efficient and cheaper, and money is always an issue. So after this splash screen on the National Numeracy Challenge, on the next screen, we now ask you this. Now, this only appeared this March. We've realized that over the years that actually confidence is probably more important actually, because it's blocking, lack of confidence with numbers is blocking people's propensity to improve their skills. In fact, it's so important to us that this week actually we're running a major campaign called Number Confidence Week, which you can find on our main National Numeracy website. We introduced this screen. Now, this is before you register, and it's a simple scale from 0 to 10. How confident do you feel with numbers? And then on the next screen, we ask a very similar question, but slightly different. This is how you feel about maths. And this is a mixture of positive and negative words. And we know from our face-to-face work that these are the most common words that people will say. So at one extreme, you've got anxious, at another extreme, you've got excited or love. So again, before they've registered, we ask the user to pick one of these words. If they then go on to register on the website, we're able to pull this data through and sit it alongside other data that we collect. After registration, what we ask the learner to do is spend 10 minutes taking what we call a skills check, which is answering a selection of multiple choice questions all about everyday maths situations like this one. At the end of that, and this has only taken people about 15 minutes, so we know how confident they feel with numbers, we know how they feel about maths. We've also actually got a reading of their skills, so we've got quite a lot of data already. Now, there's one more thing I should tell you about before Paul shares the examples, and that's each May, in the middle of May, we run our biggest national campaign called National Numeracy Day. And we try and get TV and radio and as much press as possible about this. And that's great. It brings thousands of people to the National Numeracy Challenge website. But the thing I wanted to draw your attention to was, because it's on TV and radio, etc., it brings different people to usual to the website. So we don't just get the people who want to improve their confidence or want to improve their skills. We get people who are already confident, already quite good at maths, wanting to have a look, wanting to check their skills, wanting to prove that they can still do it, which is fine. The point is, it changes the mix of our learners each May. Okay, so I'll hand you over to Paul, who'll take you through a couple of current examples of how we're using data.
Thanks, Paul. Afternoon, everybody. So as Paul says, I'm going to take you through 3 examples of how we've used data to make decisions and help users have a better experience. And in each one, I'm going to go through just the question and then what it means and then what data we needed and then the results. Because I think it's worth emphasising, it's worth dissecting the question a little. So I'll show you what I mean. So the first question we had was, are we attracting the target audience? And that initially just begs the question back, well, what do you mean target audience? So that's exactly what we did. We went back to the organisation and said, what do you mean? And they said, well, it's people with low confidence and low skills. And that's great, because as Paul just showed you, that's what we are now collecting since March. We had skills before, but never confidence. So we're going to collect the confidence score, the skills score. We're going to collect the register date, because as Paul said, that tells us a lot about the type of people. So it makes sure we're not skewing it with overconfident people or people who are not our target audience. And finally, when we say low confidence or low skills, what do we mean? We need to benchmark that. So we need some national data, and we did a survey last year at YouGov that asked some very similar questions. So we know what the UK as a whole thinks in that area. So let's get through to the data. So what we did is we created a simple heat map where we've got confidence score going up the side and skill score going across the top. And then we have a heat map here. And this is collected from when we went live with a new system up until the end of May, which is kind of when National Numeracy Day sort of finishes. Now the heat map itself, we've got red, meaning there's a lot of people, and blue, meaning there's not very many people at all. And we can see that there's a red blob there concentrated towards the upper right-hand corner, meaning higher skills, higher confidence. What about against the benchmark? Well, there's the benchmark. That's the UK that we collected in August 2019. So we can see that up until and including National Numeracy Day, we're attracting a higher than average audience. So we needed to cut the data again. So we just do exactly the same thing in June, July, with a benchmark on again, so about 6 weeks worth of data. And we can see now we're attracting a much better audience, the audience that we wanted to, our target audience. So fairly straightforward there, but again, the key was in the definitions of getting the questions teased out. But yeah, post National Numeracy Day, we are attracting people with lower skills and confidence, and their average scores are lower than the national. There we go, there's example one. What's also interesting about this graphs is that it shows there is a correlation between skills and confidence. And we'll come back to that in question 3, because we want to know how much of a correlation there is. And is that useful to us? We'll come back to that. The second question that we got asked was, are those with the greatest need being served best? And again, the first thing is, well, what do you mean greatest need? Well, this is where the word comes in. It is slightly different to the confidence score, but we wanted to say that those people with the most negative feelings towards maths are the people that need us the most. And the question then comes is, what do you mean negative, positive? Which words are negative? I think we can all pretty much get them in roughly the right buckets, but we really need data to tell us which buckets they should go in. So what we did is we got the score and the word, and we put them in a graph. So that's the average confidence score for each of those words. Okay, so there's quite a range. See, defeated is right down here with an average score of 3 on the confidence scale, and love is right up here, much closer to just over 9. In fact. And then if we order that graph and put in an average confidence score order, a pattern really starts to emerge. And funnily enough, right down at the bottom there, terrified gets the lowest confidence score, right up through love at the very end, the highest score. And this then allows us to group individuals into categories of need. So slightly arbitrary, the groups, we decided to choose 4 groups. And because we got 18 words, we can't divide them equally into numbers of words. But we chose the bottom 5, terrified through panic, to be the definition of the greatest need, changing from sick through nervous, and then bored through comfortable, and finally good through love. So that's our need. The question says, well, what about being served best? How do we define that? Well, we chose to define served best as getting further through the journey. Paul outlined a little bit of the journey there. There was there's registration, but then you start a skills check, you finish a skills check, and then you're just learning, and then hopefully we encourage you to come back to the site as well to get the idea that it's numeracy is a thing that one practices over time to keep your skills up. So that was going to be our definition of being served best, to then get through the journey. So again, so we've got need and we've got the stage through the journey. That's the data we need. So there's our 4 categories of need, from the greatest need on the left, moving through the least need on the right-hand side. And then we just go through each stage of the journey. So everybody registers, so with 100% of each group registering. But how many of them start a skills check? Well, we've got 85% of people in the anxious group, the greatest need group starting, compared to 81 on the other end. And in fact, those percentages decrease as you go from left to right. And that's statistically significant. We ran a chi-square test to check that they were different. So even though 83 and 83, when we drill down into it, there is a significant difference there. Moving on through completing a skills check, of everybody that started, we've got 93% completing in the greatest need group, through 88 at the other end. And again, the same pattern, those percentages decreasing as we move from left to right. Visiting learning resources is the next stage, and we see the same pattern. It's worth emphasising all of those things, all of those stages are statistically significant. We come through to our last group, which is this the kind of nirvana, getting everybody to return and continually check their skills. And you see a difference different picture. Firstly, there's a great drop-off across all groups, and the pattern itself breaks down as well. So there's no difference between the anxious group and the good, happy, excited group. So in conclusion, there's quite a lot to take on there, but in conclusion, those with more need are completing more of the journey. The differences are significant up until and including learning, but there is more work to do to try and encourage users to come back and recheck their skills, and that's regardless of their need and their confidence. So that's the second example. And one final example, I talked at the beginning about the correlation between skills and confidence. That's a really important one. And we have a kind of mantra is we try to collect as little data as possible. So if there's no need to put somebody through a skills test because we know what the skill score will be, because we have a confidence score, that would be amazing to not have to put anybody through something we don't need to. So the mantra is we try and collect as little as possible, and we only ever collect data if it's of use, ultimate use to the user. So wouldn't it be great if some of our registration data predicted skills later on? So that was our question. Can pre-registration data help us to predict user skills levels? And also another question, a sub-question is, should we be tailoring the journey? So if there are people with very low confidence and therefore very low skills, should we be urging them to take a skills check so early in the journey? So what does the data say? It's quite a simple collection now. It's confidence score and skills score. We have all of that. And here, this graph tells us about the average skill score for each confidence scale score. So we can see if you score a confidence scale of 10, your average skill score will be something around 14. And the error bars, these lines here, tell us the kind of range of scores that are possible within 95% of the population. And we can see these error bars are quite wide. So it doesn't bode particularly well for us being able to predict. It's a very nice gradual linear progression, but in terms of predictive power, it leaves a little to be desired. But first of all, what we noticed, and perhaps you've noticed it as well, is there was a problem with the data. We did have this lovely linear progression upwards, but down here at 0, the confidence scale 0, it seemed different. So our initial reaction is, well, that's interesting. Is it true? And then we looked into it, we found there was a problem with the system. If you went through the registration process, but didn't choose to answer the scale score question, the system assumed you'd said 0. So there was actually a whole bunch of people going in there that wouldn't have said 0, they just hadn't answered the question. So we had to go and fix the data before we could analyse. There was no way we could strip these people out at all. So we had to fix the problem, and we've got this new data now, and it does match that pattern that we would expect. As confidence increases, so does skill. What about the predictive nature? Well, there is a little to be said. It's the range of scores is very wide. There's no doubting that. But at that bottom end there, confidence scale score of 0 and 1. This means it's very unlikely for people who scored 0 or 1 to score above 16 on the skills check, and that's 16. You don't need to know, but it's quite an important score for us. We understand that it's a level of numeracy that we talk about quite a lot. So this means that perhaps we should be considering a different journey for those people, because they were very unlikely to score very high in the check. And those discussions are ongoing. There's many things to talk about, but the data has told us there is something to look into. So there we go. Those are 3 examples, a whistle-stop tour of some of the examples where we use data to make decisions to help improve the user journey and the user outcomes. But if you've got any questions, we'd love to hear them. So I think it's time to open the floor.
Hi, Paul and Paul. Sarah from UFI here. We don't have any current questions at the moment, which says to me that you made a very clear presentation. Maybe, maybe I can start off because Paul M, you said that one of your principles was to collect as little data as possible, which I thought was interesting. Can you tell us two things? One, why did you decide to do that? And secondly, what advice you would give to other organisations who are needing to decide what data to collect? So the first one is really, why did you decide to collect as little data as possible?
Shall I start that, Paul?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. There's one particular example springs to mind. 2-3 years ago, we used to ask a lot more questions pre-registration. And we used to ask a lot of demographic data, what gender, what age group, what region of the country. And we always used to say this is to collect information to help national numeracy, and we have used that information, quite extensively. And it was of a lot of use at the time to us, and therefore we would argue to the user. I think it had got to a point where nothing was really changing, so we kind of had our picture, but also at the same time we started to get feedback, particularly when we went quite big with a campaign with money saving experts. A lot of feedback from users who wanted to join us and said, well, I'm not going to because I just don't want to give you my data. So it made us really think hard about what we collect and when we collect and why we collect.
Yeah, I think it's slightly contradictory, isn't it? Because we're behind the scenes in the technical workings, we are collecting a lot of data. I think the mantra Paul outlined is about where you have to ask the user. So as Paul says, we've got it down on registration now just to email address and name. But you moved that data, didn't you? We ended up moving those demographics later in the journey.
Yeah, I mean, that's an example of something that I think we'd say was still useful, because as we broaden our reach, it's good to understand those demographics, but we ask them at a different place now, where people are more understanding of it, and it doesn't disrupt the user journey. I think that's the key thing. There's no extra screen, or there's no onerous data entry at that point.
And it's a high completion rate, isn't it? At that point,
over 99% of people complete.
Yeah, no,
and you don't have to. You can skip. You can always skip. So.
Yeah, brilliant.
Okay. That's great. Thank you very much. I've got an interesting question here, which is, do you think data collection can ever drive a particular behavior from people? E.g., they build expectations of what you want from what you are asking, and most particularly when. Do you want me to read you that again?
Please.
It's about whether data collection can ever drive a particular behavior. So do you think that data collection can ever drive a particular behavior from people? For example, they build expectations of what you want from what you're asking, and most particularly when.
I'd say yes. I mean, a positive example of that is, since we put that, the first thing you get is asking you about your confidence, and the second thing you get is asking you how you feel. We put that in March, and we have had reports that people knew it changed the way people felt about the site when they landed on it. It changed their view of what they were about to get. And possibly that's part of why, as Paul illustrated, the less confident people are actually engaging further now, because we're kind of sending a signal that the site is for them. by even mentioning this, by discussing them. So by discussing it, so I think that probably does change the mix of people who make it through registration, because we're sending that signal. Can you think of any other examples, Paul?
I was thinking about, because we have multiple journeys now. So if you choose that one of the negative words on the registration screen, you get directed to a video to show you other people who feel the same way. And we were concerned that by doing that, although yes, we're helping them, or we're trying to help them, it's another step in the journey, and therefore it's going to deplete, it will increase the attrition rate. So you have to be careful. So whenever you're collecting information or changing the journey, you have to take these things slowly, and without wanting to analyze absolutely everything, because that's the kind of other end of the scale. I think we did this just a little bit at a time. So we introduced the video, and then we just watched the rates and saw and actually, quite encouragingly, it actually improved registration rate, which is really, really good. So it meant that we were on to the right.
I think everything we put in front of people will influence the behaviour, won't it? I mean, it does send a message about. So people will, I guess, some people will think, yeah, what's the right answer here? What do they want from me? Some people might think that. So yes, I guess it does change. We see. I mean, there's nothing to indicate we're not getting honest. I mean, these questions about confidence are before people registered, so they're kind of anonymous at that point. So there's no reason for people not to be honest, I don't think, at that point.
Thanks, Paul. I've got a nice comment from Lee, who says, excellent use of analytics to determine the best journey for the end user. Explained and interesting to see how specific data and questions can influence results and outcomes.
Well, that's really nice. I mean, as I was saying, it's kind of become really central, hasn't it? To the point where we don't really even sort of think about it too much. It's kind of become second nature. And I think, and maybe that's something to do with us dealing with math skills as well, that we set off down this track, but it's just so valuable.
Yeah, I think we spent a long time thinking about where and when and what to ask, and I think that's the key thing. So, we've been through these examples, and they're all examples where you have to tease out the definitions, but typically it ends up with the definition being, well, if you just go and get that data, oh, we're actually collecting it. So we're lucky in that sense. We've not had to go back to the drawing board and design to that.
Thanks, Paul. I've got a couple of linked questions, one from Jeanette and one from Kate. And Jeanette's asking, how long did you keep your data for? And Kate's asking, how long was it before you felt you were seeing a robust pattern to the information the data provided you with? So how long did you keep the data? And also, how long was it before you felt confidence in the pattern that the data was providing you with?
Yeah, I was sending you subtle signals.
Wasn't that subtle? How long do we keep the data for? Well, we've got the 2-year GDPR, and then we can anonymise all the data after that. So that's the kind of cycle. We still have the information in terms of what these people did, but we just don't know who they are anymore. So we still have all of that data going back to the start of 2014. Although, to be honest, past previous to March this year, the system has changed so much that some of that data has become a little obsolete. In terms of how long do we wait to see a pattern, and that really depends. We're quite lucky; we get a lot of data. We get maybe on average about 100 registrations a day. But that said, we have to be constantly aware of things that can skew. National Numeracy Day is a very good example, and although it's a day, it goes on for about a month. And we've got Number Confidence Week at the moment, where there was an article in the Financial Times on Friday, Saturday, and we know those people who register as a result of that are not our target audience. We can get other little blips from sometimes a school and other things. So we just have to be constantly aware. But we're fairly lucky that, I don't know, after I'd say a few weeks, normally, if we have been able to look at the data and understand that it's quote unquote normal, then that will be enough to give us a pattern. I think the data that you can see on the screen there is generated from about 6 weeks worth of data. And you have to have enough in each point, each confidence scale score point, to say that average is robust. And it will change and shift over time, but it's showing us the patterns we expect. It won't change.
Okay, I'm still waiting for other questions to come in, but in the meantime, can you just explain to us how well what people said about how they felt about maths? And I saw some of the words like sick or anxious or love it. How well did those feelings actually map to people's ability at maths? Was there a big discrepancy? Did some people say that maths made them feel sick and anxious, but they were actually very good at it? Or
there are definitely those people, Sarah, for sure. I'm just going back to that. So that's the graph that we talked about, where the words roughly relate to confidence. It's not 100%. There are words in there which have nothing specifically to do with confidence, like bored, for example, is a good example. But they do correlate, and skills and confidence do correlate. But going back to that heat map right at the beginning, there's enough of a kind of blob in the middle of that line. You know, if it was perfectly correlated, you would absolutely see that. But we know from our data, and also from other data collected from the Money and Pension Service, for example, there's a significant number of people who are either overconfident, particularly amongst young males, people who are what they call self-doubters. So they're a small but significant minority of people that have the skills, but don't have the confidence. And I'd say they're a real key target for us. And then you have the overwhelmed as well, what we call the overwhelmed, which is people right in that bottom corner. People have neither the skills or the confidence. So there is definitely a mix there in terms of people who get their confidence and skill correlated. I'd say that's around 65%, 2/3 of people kind of get it right, as it were, but there's a third that don't.
Thanks, that's pretty impressive. I've got another question coming in, which is quite a technical one, which is when making with regards to how you collect data, when making additions or changes, is there a way you decide on the sequence or method of changes, or is the sequence of how you make changes to data collection important?
I think the best example of that was the one that we gave about demographics, collecting demographics before people have done stuff, and then we put it afterwards. I think that's a good example of that just came from user feedback. I think of another example which surprised me. We spoke to an academic at the University of Portsmouth about something completely different, but we wanted to collect some demographic data, and we wanted to collect age. And we'd always collected it in quite what we felt was quite a nice way. We didn't ask people's age directly, but we kind of asked, which buckets are you in? 16 to 25, 26 to 35, etc., etc. We got a reasonable amount of answers to that, but it was never a lot. And this academic said to us, why don't you ask them the year they were born? Which are the on the face of it, it seems like a much more intrusive question, but actually that's what we do now, and we get 99% of people giving us that data. There are people who aren't so right. People typically either give us the age they are or the year they were born, or they'll say 1900 because that's the first one in the list, or they'll say 2000. So as long as we trim the ends, we know we've got some good data.
I guess in terms of sequencing, when we're making changes to data collection, we ideally try to do it so it's still comparable with the data we've already got, don't we? Because there's probably been instances where we've made a change and then suddenly we can't compare. We lose the benefit of the historical data, hasn't there? So, but I think generally recently you've managed to make changes where we can still compare with the trend, even though you're tweaking it.
Yeah, and to be honest, most of our data that we're collecting is collected because it's just behaviour on the website. So there's no sequence to it per se. If you click on that button, we'll know you clicked on that button. If you move over here, we'll know you moved over there. And but I guess that by itself is a problem because there's so much data. So we have to try to sort of standardise it. So for example, there's a journey like we outlined in that greatest need slide. There's a journey, but you don't have to follow that journey. So so we're kind of the sequence is dictated to us by the user.
Thanks very much. There's no more questions from the audience, but I just wanted to ask you to kind of wrap up. You're obviously, as National Numeracy, you're steeped in data. You love numbers. This is your thing. Other organisations are not going to be as data or as number focused as you are. So what advice would you give to organisations who are just approaching the question and trying to work out what data they should be collecting? What have you learned from this project in terms of general advice that you could give people out there who are just starting on this journey?
I would say it's just take the time to think about what you're trying to get out of it. I think that mantra of only asking the learner what is directly beneficial to them is a really good one, because I think a lot of websites seem to be guilty of just asking a load of stuff, demographic stuff, I guess, so they can track inclusivity, which is important, but if it gets in the way of the user journey, it may be sort of counterproductive. So I guess the thing is to think about what you're trying to measure, similar to what Paul's just been saying, what's the question? Define it, and then hone in on that and try and just collect the stuff that's actually going to feed you the answers to your questions or show impact. Paul?
I'd definitely say taking your time, and if you're the data analyst and I say, Paul, can you define target audience, please? And he raises his eyebrows and, oh no, he's asking me to define. And it's really worth being a bit of a stick in the mud and saying, you've got to define this, because if you don't, you will end up getting to the end of the project and not being able to answer the question. I will say, well, we think we're attracting people with low confidence. How do you know that? You can see there's a blob, it's in the middle of the graph, but where's your benchmark? Where's all of the other stuff that supports your decisions? So it's easy to sort of run off and then get towards the end of the project and realise you haven't collected at the start what you needed to collect. So and then it's just a happy medium, really, trying to find that happy medium of collecting enough to form impact, but not discourage or influence the user journey in any way.
Hypotheses are useful, aren't they?
Say again?
Hypotheses are useful.
Yes, definitely a good hypothesis. Yeah, definitely.
That's great. That was really useful and really interesting. So I'd just like to say thank you to everybody who's been on this webinar, and particularly to the two Pauls from National Numeracy. If you've got any comments, please send them to us. Any further questions? I won't be answering them, but I will be forwarding them to those who can. Just like to invite everybody to join us on the other events on Week of VocTech, and there's a whole timetable of events that you can sign up for on our Week of VocTech page on our website. So I'd just like to say thank you very much, Paul and Paul. Thanks so much for being here. The recording of this webinar will be on the UFI website just as soon as it's rendered. So if you missed it or your friends have missed it, then please send them along to our website where they can view the recording. That's great. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.